Cinequest has a new award, our Media Legacy Award, and we're on behalf of our board and the artists that we serve. This award is given to journalists and media who have done what we feel is in many ways the most important work in the world of film. An artist makes their films. How are we as audiences going to connect with them unless great journalists and media bring us to those films? So it is a great honor for me to present this award to you, Eric Kohn, and IndieWire this evening.
Thank you so much. And I promise you it won't just be a paperweight.
Fantastic.
This really means something, I think, not just for myself, but also for the state of the profession. With me here and Harry Knowles and Kenny Turan coming out to get similar awards later this week, I think you're really sending a message that it's not just a hobby, that journalism isn't in peril, and that people who practice it can make a difference. And I'm very happy that I was able to practice, to some degree, what I do for a living, which is advocate for movies that I believe in by showing the short film, which you guys seem to like, I think, right? Okay, good. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit, but I'm just really happy to have seen it on this big screen. I'm not sure it's ever been in front of this many people before, so.
And we will talk about it a little bit more, but I'd like to start by asking you to talk about what it is about your work that you love. What brings you passion from your work?
You know, when I was a kid, my mother took me to see a repertory screening of Citizen Kane, little movie, maybe you heard of it. And there was one crucial moment when baby Charles Foster Kane is running around in the backyard, and my mother said, "Pay attention, there's a sled out there, don't miss the sled." So she kind of spoiled the movie for me. And if I've spoiled it a little bit for you, watch it and you'll figure out the rest of it. But what that moment made me realize going forward is that movies are about surprises. They're about small details that you don't notice, which is essentially what the world itself is. I grew up in sort of a religious community, and my view of the world was sort of limited, not necessarily in negative ways per se, but there were things that were out of my reach, and movies gave me that reach, and they always have. And so I travel around, I go to a lot of film festivals, I'll see 50 movies in 10 days, and to me, those are all worlds. Some of them are not worlds I necessarily want to visit, but they're all experiences that I need to have in order to understand the world that we live in more, and that's really what cinema is.
And in terms of great films journalists, is there one that maybe has been an inspiration to you or a hero, and can you talk about why they might have inspired you to get into this work? Or?
When I was a kid, I used to watch Roger Ebert on television, and it wasn't the writing that first made me notice Roger. It was the passion and the way that the conversation about movies was more important than who was right and who was wrong. The thumbs up, thumbs down thing that people always say ruined the cultural discourse was really just a way of smuggling in more people to talk and think about movies. And I was fortunate enough to get to know Roger a little bit towards the end of his life, and I'm still close with his widow, Chaz, and we've worked together on initiatives including a memorial scholarship at the past Sundance Film Festival that brought some aspiring critics to the festival this year. And what I've learned is that advocacy for cinema also means advocacy for people who love cinema. And you really get that from Roger's work, and the way that he would write about movies, he always invited you in. And there's something about that I think is so valuable. The more closed-minded you are about conversations, the least likely you're going to get people excited about the same things that you're into. And I think Roger really epitomized that, and his writing continues to epitomize that. There's so much of it that we will be learning from this man's mind for generations to come.
I remember I used to visit my university and break down films, and it was unbelievable. So now, you talk a little bit about the movie. This is a movie that we presented because it's special to you, and talking about it has surprises in it, and it's an amazing experience. I think people absolutely loved it. So could you speak a little bit about the film and your thoughts about it?
Yeah, how great is it, this thing starts up and you think it's kind of like a silly, nostalgic throwback to, Zelda or something like that, and then there's real emotion. I mean, that's really what I think movies can do for us, even in 10 minutes. I saw this short film when I was on a jury at the Philadelphia Film Festival last year. It played a couple of festivals, smaller ones for the most part, and it was a surprise to me the same way it was a surprise to all of you, just sort of that it ended up being as good as it was. And to me, what's exciting about that is if you look back on this kind of obscure award ceremony that we all watched on TV over the weekend, one of the movies that ended up being a big deal was Gravity, and everyone was excited that Gravity was this technological marvel that had real artistry to it, and I agree. But it's also a very expensive movie, and I think that cinema is itself a technology. It's always been a technology, and the famous story, whether or not it's true, is that when the Lumiere brothers showed a minute of a train arriving in the station in the 1890s, the audience ducked because they thought the train was going to hit them. Because the technology is always a marvel in the moment. And what I find interesting about this film is that it's made fairly cheap. It's using an older form of technology, but in an entirely new way. And I think that's what's really valuable about the way that movies are made now, is that you can do things for zero resources and still surprise people and show them things that they never would have thought of in their original context. Even if you grew up playing video games or you're not of the generation where you would have done that, I think you can still isolate the emotion in this thing in an entirely new and unique way. And looking for those kinds of surprises is what makes this an interesting job and something that's worthwhile. And there's also something about advocating for new voices. 2 years ago, there was a movie that some of you probably saw called Beasts of the Southern Wild, ended up getting nominated for Best Picture and all these different sort of things. Really beautiful film. And I was at the premiere for that film, but more importantly, before it showed up at the Sundance Film Festival and then made the rounds and people sort of, lavished it with praise, that filmmaker, Ben Zeitlin, made a short film called Glory at Sea, which you can find online. And it really sets the stage for what the kind of mature voice you see in this very poetic film and in this sort of existential poetic style that he uses. And that's really, I think, what's valuable in terms of looking at short films, is that you're going to see these voices right before they become fully born artists. And I think that's what you're seeing here with this director, Emily Carmichael, whose work you should look up. You can Google her name or RPGOKC, and you'll see she's done a couple other shorts, but not a feature yet. But if every person in this room sort of spreads the word, then together we can help make sure that somebody like this sticks around and continues to do what they do so well. So, to me, that's what's really exciting about it. Is I watched, I think, maybe 3 hours worth of short films when I was on this jury, and this was the one that really got under my skin and stayed with me. So I'm so glad that we were all able to kind of share it again tonight.
Talk to us a little bit about something outside of work and film that you love doing, and why.
Well, it kind of goes hand in hand. It's a nice perk of the job, but I'm a big traveler. I love to travel. My father is Colombian, and I used to go to Colombia each year when I was growing up, and then I would come back to the States, and my classmates would always think, that my dad was a drug lord or something. I said, no, he was a mathematician. But there's something really valuable about pushing beyond whatever your immediate surroundings are and sort of exploring different parts of this world, and cinema does that to some degree, but you really have to put your feet on the ground and wander. Last summer I hiked to Machu Picchu. It was a 5-day hike, and we didn't have a whole lot of resources. We weren't super comfortable. We didn't shower, but when we got to the end of the line, it didn't really make a difference because we were looking at the ruins of a civilization that was so far removed from where we were at that particular moment. It just made you so much more cognizant of not just how big the world is right now, but how long it's been in existence. And that's why I travel. And the film festivals, sometimes they're a nice excuse, but there's much more to it than that. And I encourage more people to do it. I worry that, because we live in this kind of global village and connectivity is so much a part of who we are, and maybe your next person on the stage can delve into that a little bit more. But I do worry that there's a sort of hesitation on the part of people to move around as much. And as much as I love sitting in a dark room staring at a screen, I think that we should also, make an effort to get outside and see the world as much as possible. Oh, good. You agree?
You mentioned your father was a mathematician and you delve in and live in the world of the arts. Are there similarities in terms of the ways, or just are they totally different folks?
The interesting thing about art is that people assume that it's sort of this loosey-goosey thing that people just kind of do intuitively. It's actually much more methodical than that. There are good ways of doing it and bad ways of doing it, and that's not an objective statement, it's just a reality. Things work for you or they don't work for you, and that's why I think it's necessary to have a certain kind of foundation in the humanities before you can even talk about creative disciplines. There's a lot of young people who like to go to film school, straight out of high school, and sometimes that pays off. In other cases, I wonder if, you might be better off getting an English degree first or studying philosophy first, and just sort of, there's probably a couple professors here who agree with that assertion. I just think that, what I learned from growing up in a household with a mathematician was that, systematically thinking about the world is so much more important than just having base reactions to things. I don't know if you guys ever saw the brilliant film directed by Mike Judge called Idiocracy. And there's I like these guys clap at everything. They're my biggest fans here. I'm gonna get your information after the show. Idiocracy has this vision of the future in which people watch reality shows where people get kicked in the crotch and so forth. And I think it's sort of, what it's basically saying is that the less that we think about things in a measured fashion, the more likely we're just going to react to them in the stupidest way possible because we're all just a bunch of apes. And, yes, that's true. We're already seeing it happen. And so I think it's just really valuable to kind of break down the world around us with as much discipline as we can bring.
So, this process of discovery, where you get to see movies, and we're lucky at Cinequest, and folks here, you can see 86 United States world premieres. What is that? And that's exciting to me that when you get to see something before other people have seen it. Talk about that process, and is it something that you enjoy? And
it was interesting. Before I came here, not to brag or anything, I did actually go to the Oscars, and it was really interesting to, yeah, it was cool. You should try it sometime. If you watch that ceremony on TV, you could see that there's a certain kind of artifice in play. And when you're sitting behind the cameras and you're in the room, I think you see that the narrative is much bigger than that. And I wrote about this today. There was one point in time where an award was announced, and some people, one person won, other people didn't. And I went out to the bar, which is what you do at the commercial breaks, and I ran into some of the losers. And that was so much more interesting than talking to the guy who was holding the statue, because everybody wants to talk to him. And traveling around and seeing movies in advance and kind of getting ahead of the stories or helping to define them is, I think, the most valuable aspect of this job, and it's something that everybody does when you basically take an active stance on this particular art form and try to seek it out as much as possible. When I was at the Sundance Film Festival this year, like I said, I'm seeing many, many movies in a very short period of time. Most of them don't have distribution yet, and there are films at this festival in a similar situation. And what you end up understanding is that this is the densest marketplace for any kind of culture that we've ever experienced in the history of, consciousness, basically, which is daunting. And when you see so many movies, there were 900 movies reviewed by the New York Times last year, and when you see so many movies in such a short period of time, what you realize is that, somebody has to sift through this madness, or else nothing's going to stand out except, the Avengers or something like that, which, some of those movies are good. Some of those movies are good. When you have millions of dollars at your disposal, you better use it well. But there's a lot of great stuff that's made for, $10,000, $40,000, and there's something really, really valuable about being able to single out the ones from that crop and say, these things need to be talked about as well.
And thank you for doing it. And so we'd like to take more time, but we're going to close this evening by just ask you to please tell us a little bit about what you're really proud of. IndieWire has been a great voice of independence for Mavericks, we call them Cinequest, for years. What are you most proud of about IndieWire's tradition and the legacy, and then what they're doing and you're doing today?
It's interesting because those of you who go listen to Harry later this week, I think you'll get an interesting contrast to my feelings about some of this stuff. Because IndieWire and Kohn both started in the late 90s, I think Harry really popularized that this sort of outlet for being a film enthusiast, the voice of somebody who's just really excited about movies, and that's like an okay thing to be. With IndieWire, I think what we did, we capitalized on a very particular niche community as it was emerging. You know, the site was born 2 or 3 years after Richard Linklater and Slacker sort of landed on the map, and Robert Rodriguez, people like that, who were kind of, mavericks in their own right. And we've tried to maintain that tradition as the site has grown and the media landscape has changed, and there are different kinds of business pressures being placed on us. In my own case as a critic, I started writing for the site at a point where a lot of people thought that it wasn't a job anymore. And so to me, I was thinking about the tradition of this site and the kind of need for our community to remain as robust as possible. So my contribution to IndieWire was creating something called the Critic Wire Network, which is sort of what we like to call our smart Rotten Tomatoes. It's a network of now about 500 film critics from around the world, and they grade movies, but you can also learn more about where they write and what other kinds of work they do and what kind of movies they want to advocate for. So what we're trying to do is create the most diverse representation possible of all these different people talking about movies in different ways, and it just keeps growing. So, no matter how many naysayers there are out there, my feeling is we're heading in the opposite direction from the idiocracy future, and that we're bringing more voices to the table, and that means more movies to talk about.
Would you please join me in thanking Eric Kohn for everything he's done for us and for being with us tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much.